I've taken a slightly different kind of angle from the question that Jed posed. So I've got half a presentation, which is a little bit about some of the work I've done, and then half a presentation about some of the things that I've used my experiences on and with. So I have more of a physical regeneration background, but hopefully that'll become a little bit more obvious as we go through the slides. So this is me. My name's Dave Sharp. If you want to tweet me at any point, there's my Twitter. So this is where I grew up. It's a place called Yarm in the Tees Valley. You've probably never heard of it, but it has won Village of the Year, Town of the Year several times. I couldn't honestly tell you why, and certainly when I was growing up, the place was just a non-event. I always knew I was leaving, probably as a teenager. There was somewhere else I was going. Middlesbrough is the closest thing I've got to a hometown. It's in the northeast of England. It's about 10 miles from where I grew up. So that was always my anchor point as a teenager, as a kid growing up. Middlesbrough was the biggest, closest thing to where I lived, and kind of my first kind of real interaction with a large space or a large environment. But that didn't really hold anything for me, if I'm honest. So as I continued to grow up, I still didn't see Middlesbrough as an anchor. It wasn't a place I was going to commit to. So my first real step out into the real world came leaving home, starting my first job, moving to London. The words I associate now with London at that point in my life were really just, it was old and random, and it was really kind of diverse based on where I'd come from. And I spent a lot of time walking around the streets, not using the tube, which my co-workers at the time found bizarre. But I kind of actually wanted to stand out on the street and see and hear things and not just travel around underground. So I used the underground very little, really, and you spend a lot of time walking around above ground, just trying to have the most experience I could have while living in that environment. I then moved here. This is Austin in Texas. It's completely different at the other end of the spectrum. So if I had to apply words to Austin, I'd be looking at kind of, it's relatively new as a place. It's only 150 years old. It's not the thousands of years old that London is, but it's very manicured and very planned. It's very organized. It's quite green considering it's in a desert, but it's very well manicured. And it's very hot. It is in the middle of a desert. And arriving here, having come from London and then having previously come from a smaller place like Middlesbrough, I was kind of fascinated with the adherence to the design. So actually you can walk around Austin and find anything that you want by thinking it through. So like the DMV, the driving license place is actually next to the bus station, because if you need a driving license, you need to get there on the bus. So they've thought the whole thing through. It's very, very well prepared. And when you arrive, it's very structured and very easy as an environment to navigate. I then moved here. This is Irvine in California, Southern California. It's pretty much the last place you see, leaving LA and heading towards San Diego. It's pretty new as a place. It's actually only existed since 1971, when they amalgamated three other kind of residential areas together and called it Irvine. You can see there's a style to it. All the buildings look the same. It's very regular. It's very easy to navigate. Again, a bit like Texas, a bit like Austin. It's planned, manicured, organized. There's gardeners, there's tree people, there's, everything is there, but it's very residential. There's no business there. It's a commuter area essentially for Southern LA. I then went from there to here. So I moved to New York. and went back more towards the kind of London feeling. So now, you know, being in a large metropolitan area, you can always see the sky in California. It's hard to find the sky in New York. The buildings dominate, it's noisy, it's intense. It's very, very high tempo as an environment. But I used to live on Long Island and I would get the train to Manhattan every day. And I really realized there's a real extreme between the haves and the have-nots. If you live on Manhattan Island and you live south of 110th Street, you're in the kind of have category. But my train used to go through Flatbush and Flushing, parts of Queens, Brooklyn, Coney Island, and those places are really quite deprived. So we have this environment of, you know, a small part of the environment is very, very affluent. A large part of the environment is very definitely not. And it's very, the contrast is quite stark. You know, as you move out of Manhattan and onto Brooklyn, it just goes from the have to the have not in a fraction of a second. And it's right there in kind of glorious Technicolor for you to see. I then moved to Glasgow, which was a complete step change from pretty much everything. So I lived in Partick. It's one of the older areas of the city. Absolutely loved it. I always felt that Glasgow was a bit in its renaissance. So lots of new buildings going up, redevelopment of the waterfront. and some of the more historic areas were probably getting a little left behind. So beginning to get the kind of New Yorky kind of steel and glass in one area, old traditional buildings in another as kind of demarcation lines about where development was taking place. But generally enjoyed my time in Glasgow, and I still own a flat there. When I left, I didn't really want to sell my flat, so I hung on to it. And that brought me right back to Middlesbrough. So I'd kind of done a complete loop, London to Texas to California to New York to Scotland and back again. And that whole first part of my journey left me with a bunch of experiences and understanding of what it's like to be in different places and not be a native, not always understand everything that's in front of you, not always recognize everything that's around you. And I came back to Middlesbrough to effectively work on a regeneration project for Middlesbrough called Digital City. And that was a £40 million government funded initiative to give Middlesbrough a bit of a digital kickstart. The intention there to try and create Middlesbrough's first digital cluster of companies. There wasn't much there when we started in 2003. About 85, 86 companies existed by the end of 2008. So that's kind of where my regeneration workflow started. I now live in Durham, and Digitale feels like early stages of Digital City again. We've got some pretty good ideas and some plans to digify some of the things, some of the more interesting parts of Durham, and hopefully what comes out of the back of things like this symposium will kickstart that effort with the university and with the council and the BID and other partners. So just I thought I'd give you a quick whiz around some of the more kind of placemaking things that I've been involved with. So I've done a number of regeneration projects in different places. I did some work in Bergen in Norway. It has a very historic, very northern nature to it. It's very in the middle of nowhere. It's ring-fenced by nature and not far off the Arctic Circle. You know, there are a number of issues that Bergen faces. It's definitely a place for tourism, but not necessarily a place for industry. And trying to find ways of bringing digital to somewhere as far north as Bergen was a bit of a challenge. But I'm happy with the idea that what we've left behind from that project is there are now a cluster of digital projects running out of Bergen. And I did use some of the digital city experience from Middlesbrough to seed some of the activities in Bergen. This is Troy, which is in upstate New York. So it's a small town. It has a Yarm-like quality to it where I grew up. It's kind of had an identity. So it is the place where the phrase Uncle Sam generated. It used to feed the American Army through pork and beef, and those products had Uncle Sam printed on them, and that became a generic term for the US. So it's got some history, it's got some culture, but it is a small town, and its population generally drains into New York or Albany, which is the state capital. So the project there to bring the market back, we focused on makerspaces, and Troy now has a very large active makerspace community based around some kind of physical stuff that we created. This is Kokomo, which is in Indiana. It's just north of Indianapolis. This town, a bit like Middlesbrough, had a lot of overlap with what had happened with Middlesbrough. Traditional industries had moved away. They'd had a car factory. They'd had some small tech companies that had moved back into Indianapolis. But its roots were in farming. So in conjunction with Purdue University, we created an agri-tech kind of incubator. Most of the farms in and around Kokomo were happy to get involved, and that has become a real leaf spring for them now. They've kind of moved on from car making and small scale digital projects. They're now running very intensive and high tech agriculture incubation across the farming communities around Kokomo. So this is Cardiff in Wales. I've been involved with the Welsh Assembly and the Welsh Government for a number of years on various digital projects. The thing I would always highlight about Cardiff is the Cardiff Bay development. So they opted to develop a part of the environment which is not the city centre, which I always felt was, one, the right thing to do, and two, a brave thing to do. So Cardiff Bay is about a mile and a half away from the main centre of Cardiff. There are lots of lessons to be learned from the Cardiff experience, and I would encourage anybody that's involved in physical regeneration to take a long, hard look at Cardiff, but I've been involved in a lot of the incubation spaces that were developed to try and get small businesses and entrepreneurs running. And if you're interested in that, you should check out Tramsheds. Tramsheds is the latest and largest incubator that we've opened in Cardiff. So Belfast in Northern Ireland. I have a parent from Belfast. I know Belfast well from growing up. So different scenario with Belfast after the Good Friday Agreement. They were free and able and capable of doing a lot more than they would have done prior to that. It's still very much a mixture of physical regeneration, digital regeneration. So the thing about Belfast is it does have a lot of unused physical spaces that are really right for regeneration. But you need, if you treat buildings like hardware, you need software to go in it. So there's more of a push now to develop small businesses through incubators to then go and redevelop the spaces for them to occupy further down the line. This took us to Mong Kok, which is an area of Hong Kong. So I've been a visiting lecturer at one of the universities in Hong Kong for a while. And Mong Kok is probably simply one of my most favorite places on the planet. It's so intense. It's so compact. It's really intriguing to see how people use that space, misuse that space. And I'm never really sure that I understand what they would change about that space. But the nighttime market is just the epicenter of a lot of activity for a lot of Hong Kong inhabitants. And I still like to just stand in the middle of it all and watch what people are doing. It's very, very intriguing just to see how they navigate that space and what they do and what they don't do and what's new and what's faded away over time. So Arvika in Sweden. So again, I've got activities that I've run with the Swedish government that date back to 2006. Arvika was my favorite project for a number of reasons. It's in the far north of Sweden, a bit like Bergen in Norway. It's very cold. It's very difficult to get to. Most Swedes have heard of it, but most Swedes have never been there. And when I arrived in Arvika, because I do live in these places, I go and live in these places before I try and run anything. I always feel that you need to be as educated as you can about what these places are actually really like, rather than just read about it. So I lived in Arvika for a while. And in the end, we just thought we needed to raise awareness. There wasn't an activity, there wasn't a piece of physical regeneration we felt was really appropriate. So we created an event, a live music event. And in 2009, Depeche Mode played live in Arvika with 30,000 people arriving into a town that's, half that in population for a 3-day music event. It was transformational. The tourism rose, the awareness of Arvika rose, new businesses arrived. All sorts of things happened off the back of that music event. And it's one of the standout projects that I've kind of been involved with. So what am I moving on to now? So I'm about to start work in Ipswich in Suffolk. I guess the thing I would say that what I've learned over the time that I've been doing this is that most things you can't carry them around. You've really got to start from scratch each time. You've got to involve yourself with the local community. You've got to learn about what it's like to be in these places and how these people feel about the place that they live in. And that'll be the case with Ipswich. So I'm going to be spending some weeks down in Ipswich to kind of absorb myself into kind of what Ipswich is and does and how it works. Possibly there are things from my previous projects that will seed new activities in Ipswich, but equally likely that there isn't, and there'll have to be a new and deliberate attempt to come up with something to fuel further growth in Ipswich. So that's me, and I'm happy for you to tweet me if you've got any particular questions.